here we go for Bitcoin, starting off with a bit of a different look on this one because, you know, realistically in the short-term time frames, the price action has been more or less the same. I don't really have too much to add there, although we will certainly touch on that a little bit later. But I want to start off with something that I think can add a bit of an enhancer on this bias, which is simply looking at Tether dominance, represented by the blue line chart right here, a cyan line chart right here. Essentially, what you need to know about this, or the relevancy of it, is that it does play opposite of essentially Bitcoin's price action. Now, this was not true for one segment in the history of, both these histories. That was from about March 2020, the Rona dump, to that first retest of Bitcoin's per ultimate at $20,000 in December of 2020. Other than that, and that was a different, financial environment, obviously. Other than that, though, they have been very consistently on the macro schedule, opposite of each other. So the reason why I'm calling this out right now is because I think that there's a bit of an easier call to be had on Tether dominance rather than Bitcoin right now, although they should naturally kind of, align with each other in a inverse way, right? So if we go over here into the Tether dominance chart only, and we put back on some hollow dildos over here, put on some moving averages perhaps as well, and then also put on my drawing tools and perhaps a bit of these good old indicators right here, what we can see is we can see one major macro consolidation, obviously. And this consolidation has just tested the top side of that macro ceiling for the third time in the past couple of years here, actually going back to August 2020, by the way. So I am looking at this as a rejection coming in from these levels. We do see a drive, a bearish divergence forming on the weekly RSI, which is, rather high term time frame for this. So likely does hold a fair bit of weight. We even see the weekly jewel starting to turn down here as well. And this is all within the context of declining volatility. In fact, getting to similar levels that we saw in November 2021 before that last, before the last major breakdown actually. And May 2021 as well, which was also before the last major breakdown. Now, of course, volatility is direction neutral, so this is not always going to have this is not always going to be major breakdowns for Bitcoin. For example, right here, November 2020, the opposite effect, right? It just speaks towards the severity of the move very likely incoming. So we're very likely looking at, a major shift in momentum, let's say. So, what could I also combine with this in order to get a bit more of a bias on the direction of which is likely to break, not just because, it's testing into the top side of a multi-year resistance, but we do see that all of the low volatility periods where the RSI has been in the bullish control zone, and especially this one right here, which is putting in some bearish divergence, have resulted in downside moves. So I can just mark a few off right here to make that visually apparent, hopefully, at least. We have this one right here, starting off from that high, getting rejected from the bullish control zone, boom, down. Obviously, what's it called? I guess, yeah, it's, more around there. And then let's see, we do have a very small iteration right here from, June, July of 2020, obviously leading into this region right here. Again, a very small short-term downside angle. Same thing over here in August 2021 off of the summer bear trap, of course. Again, these ones were a lot more minuscule than perhaps what we're looking at over here. But do keep in mind that on the macro schedule, we do see that it is, within the context of putting in some higher lows, and that would be bullish long term. So there is still a long-term, threat to the downside, a major long-term threat to the downside for Bitcoin. But in the short term, relative to a weekly, of course, so that's not like today, for example, but on the weekly schedule, for like the next few weeks, I do think that there's more likely to play out some downside than not. We spoke about this, I believe, on Monday, perhaps, or maybe it was last week on Friday, but ultimately I'm just kind of reiterating these thoughts with a little bit more detail. And we can also still look at an invalidation for these regions. I think before I said it was 469, I'd say the same thing today as well. Until that happens, I think that all daily bounces are just another lower high, very likely to lead lower. Here's the thing though, and I would keep a keen eye on this region right here, 360, anywhere between about 360 and 380 or so. I actually need to make my blue box a little bit bigger in this case right there is perfect. This is where I would be expecting a higher low if this one is going to end up being long-term macro bullish, meaning that if you start to see major bounces right here and then it bounces back above, let's say about 4% or so, that would be phenomenally fucking bearish for Bitcoin. Very likely. Until then, I'm looking over the next few weeks, maybe another short-term bounce around this region, but ultimately very likely coming down into this region right here, which is likely going to coincide with some short-term Bitcoin upside alongside that downside move. And then the question is, does that put in a higher low or not? If it does, well, kiss this market goodbye for a while. If it doesn't, then hey, all good in the hood, and you're probably going to see that major rally up. But until then, it's kind of just still splitting hairs here. We can also go look at traditional markets as well. I do think that they have some good insight into the direction of this market. Obviously, the correlation between Bitcoin and NASDAQ, for example, which has been very, 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 very well documented in the past years, which certainly lost its edge, I would say, in 2021 when traditional markets were just straight up the whole goddamn way through. And on any downside move for NASDAQ, for example, Bitcoin would just, absolutely puke. And on the upside moves, it put in like these anemic upside drives as well. In this case, this is a little bit less related. However, I do look at NASDAQ as still essentially like a major indice for Bitcoin, almost, in the sense that in the same way that you look at like Bitcoin versus an altcoin. It's like when Bitcoin goes up, yeah, altcoins get to go up as well. The ones that are weaker, typically, they don't get to go up as much. The ones that are stronger, they get to go up more. Well, typically speaking, Bitcoin acts weaker to NASDAQ's upside moves. And in this case right here, the reason why I believe that it is relevant is that short term, I do expect this rally to continue, actually. There very likely will be pullbacks along the way. In fact, I was going to say on the short term, probably a pullback in the probably a pullback sooner rather than later. But now that I look at it, I actually do think that this one does try another short-term upside move from here. Very likely somewhere, perhaps somewhere right around about just around 15,000, maybe just under 15,000 or so. And then that's kind of the next major area that I'll be keeping a keen eye on. What would be massively bearish for this, however, or I wouldn't say massively bearish, but very likely imply a pullback first before any sort of a try higher, would be if this one does come back down below about 14,400. So those are kind of the areas to watch for me right now. Until then, I do kind of expect a bit more of a short-term sideways and probably another try up. Doesn't really do too much for the higher term time frames, unfortunately. But for right now, the major focus is on the weekly. And I believe that we are seeing, a bit of a pity bounce in, at least a pity bounce right here, as we do see volatility coming off of very, 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 very high extremes. And we do see that, it's bouncing after a pretty nasty downside move. This is obviously not a humongous move for like a crypto, for example, but for traditional markets, this is a humongous, absolutely groundbreaking move. It's 23%, which anything above like 20% is considered bear market territory. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the implication of that is right here. So I do look for this to bounce a little bit more. If you are going to be massively bearish on this, probably looking at something resembling a lower high between about 15,000-ish to 15,250, let's say. And obviously, if you're bullish, you're just looking for it to bulldoze through there and reclaim about 15.6 or so. Until then, it does still remain on the more bearish side long term. More than likely, though, continues on with the bounce short term here, especially into the end of the month, which is also going to be the end of the quarterly. And the reason why it's important that it's the end of the quarterly is that a lot of big money managers, they get new money comes into the market at the beginning of a new quarter. That's just the way that they kind of operate, the way that their sort of systems are set up, and so you do kind of typically look for things to start off with a bit of a green, or in this case, a cyan day, into a time like that, kind of front running those players. So I would keep an eye on that. Again, just speaking off the cuff here, like ever so slightly juicing the probabilities in that favor. And then we can get to Bitcoin, which we haven't even touched in at all today. So let's do that right now. Let's go over here, go back to the chart that we were working off of for the past week or so. Or sorry, for the past like month or so, realistically, going back to like early March here. Anyways, in this case, I still look at this as an overall uptrend. The one thing that I could change right here, however, is something that we've been changing steadily as Bitcoin proves itself on these upside moves. And I could now move up the point of failure, aka the validation for downside, not from 40,500 any longer, but I could move it up about another $1,000 to about 40,100 on a 4-hour closure, or 40,700 on an hourly closure. If one of those two things happens, very likely this does come down further, first to about 40,000 even, very likely a short-term bounce then, and then, very, very likely somewhere back down around 39, which very likely has another short-term bounce. And personally speaking, I do think that things would initiate a general run over time, not on the same day, but over the next, like the following week or two, very likely back down to the 37,000 to 37,500-ish region right here. That's essentially what I'd be looking for. And that would, while that technically does not constitute a break, very, 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 very likely to break down from there and initiate that 45% move to the downside. So I've just referenced a 45% move. Do I need to explain this again? Sure, why not? Well, might as well over here. I can do this quickly enough now. But basically, I do believe that there is a big 45% move in the midst here. Not today, not tomorrow. Probably starts around end of this month, perhaps the last week of this month, which we're rapidly approaching here, to be fair. But again, the totality of this move is unlikely to hit until, at least later point in whatever the month is after March, which is April. Yeah. Anyways, the reason why I say this is because we are hitting extremes here to the downside, that is, on 5-day BBWP. We can measure this out many years in the past, but I'll just look at these last couple of years right here, of which we do see the past 4 iterations of this. And by the way, we're working on number 5 right now, have produced a very, very similar response on price action, thus producing about, on average, about 45% gain to the upside or the downside from that price point. And it typically happens over the course of about 40 to 50 days or so, let's say, on average, obviously. And so if we were to add that to the upside, that would be printing Bitcoin somewhere around about $56,000. If we added that to the downside or subtracted that to the downside, that'd be more around about 23, 24,000 bucks. From current price action. So do keep that in mind. And realistically, while I feel very, very confident that we're going to get a move like that probably around the end of April or so, let's say, the question is, what actually really defines a trigger for that move? It's the same thing as before, obviously. Nothing's changed there. I don't want to bore you with the details of this, but basically, I would confirm that move above 45,000 bucks or $44,500 on a daily closure or a higher term time frame closure. That does have a technical target based off of this as an ascending triangle all the way up to $56,000 to $55,000, directly in line with that 45% projection or so. Also in line with the 3.272 Fibonacci extension. And then of course we got the weekly over here, of which that would naturally confirm another drive of hidden bullish divergence along the way, probably above about $43,000. I think it does start to show that as potential yet again, and that has a natural short-term target, short-term relative to a weekly, obviously, at around 51-ish thousand, and a secondary target towards about 57 or so thousand. So that would also kind of play within the context of that. Obviously to the downside, a lot more simplistic in this sense, but simplistic typically equals quite good in my experience. But we do see that the monthly MACD chart, I keep on going back to this one. It's simple as fuck, but it gets a job done. And we've seen anytime that the monthly MACD crosses the downside plus price action losing the white 20 simple has produced a move to the green 55 exponential average on this chart each and every time. It's happened 3 times in the history of Bitcoin. It's not very many iterations, but if those conditions are met, that would be at least my sort of that would be my proclivity towards looking for a move like that. And basically that would be, Elsa's just laughing in the background. I've had enough of it. Anyways, what would trigger this move right here? Well, we already have the monthly MACD crossing the downside, obviously. The next key critical ingredient of this would be closing below the white 20 simple on the monthly, which is about 38,500 bucks. And I do think that, yes, if Bitcoin starts to close below there, even on like a weekly, for example, very, 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 very likely to see that move happen in the following, month or two, let's say. Until then, we can use a few things as a proxy to kind of get a bias on direction, obviously. I've been promoting this chart right here, the 5-day stochastic momentum oscillator, of which, this would suggest upside from here. Obviously, each and every time that we've seen the 5-day momentum oscillator, the 5-day stochastic momentum oscillator be in position alongside that 5-day BBWP, it has led towards basically continuation in that direction towards that final 45% destination. But for right now, obviously it's to the upside. Obviously it's gotten out of the bearish control zone. In order to maintain this condition, Bitcoin must remain on a closing basis above 39,330 or so. And what also should be known is that the 5-day BBWP, yesterday we did see that it was getting an ever so slight positive tick right here. Obviously right now, because things have been, more or less volatile in the last 24 hours, it's actually flattened out. So we actually don't have that positive curvature just yet. That will only be fully confirmed upon closure. So technically speaking, if we do see this get a positive slope, like a nice positive slope, especially above the moving average on it, and the moving average getting a positive slope, that would be the perfect signal in this case. And that alongside the 5-day stochastic would, I think, be a front runnable signal, just personally speaking. Obviously, you are free to make your own decisions for yourself, but But just based off the history of that, I do think that that would be front runnable, and that would very likely imply that the upside does get confirmed. Problem is, again, at the end of the day, price action is king and price action matters most. And price action says, above, until Bitcoin's back above about $44,500, $45,000, still just, it's nice to have in the background, but it's not quite there just yet. Anyways, again, basically the crux of the message today is that below 41,000 BAT, very likely going to see back down towards 38, 39. Again, with bounce along the way. Until then, I do still think that the Boo laws have the probabilities in their favor. I think that the general scheme kind of favors them for the time being, but we haven't really seen anything massively new other than that. I suppose we can go check out stochastic momentum over here from the short-term time frame perspective and see where these pivots are at, and maybe come up with a short-term bias. Although I'm kind of the same opinion yesterday. I look for a trend continuation here to the upside until proven otherwise, which again, proven otherwise is at least a 4-hour closure below 41,000 bucks. In this case, we see 6-hour stochastic momentum will turn down with any sort of a closure below 42,400. Bitcoin's obviously about $300 below that, with 5.5 hours left to go, basically. So it's it's not super relevant for the short term just yet, but definitely something to be keeping aware of. The 4 hours also freshly crossing down will be remaining with downside momentum as long as Bitcoin's closing below 42.8. Obviously we are $700 below, about $700 below there right now. 3 hour is also going to be showing what is going to be showing a lotus speed, and also heading down below about 42.7. So that number starting to come up a few times here. And then the hourly is also going to be freshly crossing up above about $42,000. So, very, 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 very short term. Likely to try a little bit more on this bounce, probably somewhere right around about 42.4 actually. And then we'll see if Bitcoin reclaims any one of those critical regions. And from there, I probably would be looking for continuation up to the next blue box. The blue box of peace and prosperity right here, of which I'll just show it one more time. It's basically between about 44 and 45,000 bucks. These ranges are tightening obviously here. Again, we were kind of musing at the beginning of the stream that these, this time especially is quite reminiscent of the slower times that we've seen, not really in the past year actually, but I would say more or less what we saw back here on the March 2019 reversal to the upside, and back here in the September, October, November major downside move as well. So I do think that we are looking at something similar to that. Both of those were obviously like 50% moves right off the bat as well. I think that we're going to see the same scenario over here, to be quite honest with you. Anyways, hopefully that was helpful, and there you go for Bitcoin, sirs and zers.